All right, so picture this. You're just starting your day, right? Maybe thinking about that first cup of coffee or what you
Mm.
need to get done, and then boom, your whole world gets turned upside down. Like you're talking the deafening roar of machinery, the ground shaking beneath you, and then you see it bulldozers just rolling right towards your home.
It's hard to even imagine that feeling of safety and security just completely vanishing in an instant. You know what really gets me is the power dynamic at play here. It's like in a society where we have laws and procedures to protect people, how can something like this even happen?
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this idea of bulldozer justice and this really shocking case in Allahabad. This wasn't just some local dispute. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court of India, and they did not hold back. They called it inhuman and illegal. I mean, when the highest court uses language like that, you know it's serious.
Yeah, the Supreme Court's condemnation really highlights the foundations of any just system. You've got to have due process. The law has to be supreme when the state or anyone acting for them operates outside of those rules. It erodes the whole idea of fairness and equity in that phrase, inhuman and illegal, that carries a lot of weight legally. It's not just an emotional response.
And here's what makes this whole thing even crazier. These weren't people squatting on land illegally. These families have been living in their homes for years, some of them decades. So you've got to wonder, why would this happen? What could possibly justify this kind of action against people who've been there for so long, figuring out what happened, why it happened, and how the Supreme Court got involved? That's what we're going to unpack today.
It also raises the question of who's responsible. If these people weren't there illegally, then the demolition itself was wrong. So who made the decision? What was the chain of command? Understanding how something with such huge consequences could happen is crucial. It's not enough to just call it a mistake. We need to look at the system that allowed it to happen.
So let's try to piece together how this unfolded. From what we understand, these six families, and we're talking a lawyer, a university professor, were targeted in this demolition drive. And the reason behind it is, well, it's mind-blowing. The authorities seem to have believed that these properties were connected to a gangster-turned-politician, Atiq Ahmed, and his brother.
What's really striking is how they jumped from suspicion to destruction. In a system that follows the rule of law, you need investigation evidence presented in court and a legal decision before you can take such a drastic step. The idea that authorities could just assume ownership and demolish homes without a clear legal basis is very disturbing. It completely bypasses all the safeguards that are in place to protect property rights.
It's almost like they thought, well, these might be linked to someone we're investigating, so let's just bring in the bulldozers. The normal steps of investigation evidence, court orders, all of that seems to have been ignored. And the Supreme Court really called them out on it. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. They ordered the Uttar Pradesh government to pay 10 lakh rupees to each of these families, and they gave them a deadline, 6 weeks, no more.
That compensation order shows how serious this injustice was. It's the highest court acknowledging a major violation. But it also makes you think, can money ever really make up for losing your home, the disruption to your life, the emotional distress? It's a concrete remedy for something that can't really be measured.
And this doesn't seem like a one-time thing, does it? During the Supreme Court hearing, Justice Ujjal Bhuyan brought up another disturbing case from Ambedkarnagar district. There's video footage of bulldozers demolishing small huts. And in the middle of all the chaos, you see this young girl running away, clutching her school books. It's a heartbreaking image, isn't it? Instruments of progress and education forced to flee from the very machines that are supposed to be serving the community.
That connection to the Ambedkarnagar case is important. It suggests that what happened in Allahabad might not be an isolated incident. It could be part of a bigger pattern or approach. And that raises concerns about whether this bulldozer justice is becoming more common. Are they sidestepping the legal process in favor of immediate and often irreversible action? It makes you wonder if this is becoming the go-to method for dealing with certain situations.
And then there's the statement reportedly made by Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath himself. He apparently told PTI that this bulldozer justice isn't some accident. It's an achievement, a necessity. That's a completely different perspective from the Supreme Court, right? It's like they have two completely different ideas of what justice means.
Exactly. The chief minister's defense highlights this tension between wanting swift action to maintain order and the constitutional requirement of due process and protecting individual rights. It forces us to think about whether urgency can ever justify bypassing legal safeguards and risking irreversible harm.
So let's dig into the specifics of why the Supreme Court said the Allahabad demolitions were illegal. It comes down to one basic principle following the rules, or in this case, the failure to do so. There's a law called the UP Urban Planning and Development Act of 1973, and it clearly lays out the steps that have to be taken before any demolition can happen legally.
And this act, just like similar laws in many places, is designed to make sure things are fair and prevent authorities from acting on their own. It says you have to properly notify the people involved, give them a chance to respond to any allegations, and most importantly, they have the right to appeal a demolition order. These are essential protections against the power of the state, and they ensure that decisions aren't made unilaterally.
Right. So what actually happened in Allahabad? Well, they issued a show cause notice back in December 2020 and then another one in January 2021. But here's the problem. Both of those notices were just pasted on the doors of the homes. They weren't properly served. They weren't given directly to the residents or acknowledged with a signature.
The way a legal notice is served is so important. Just sticking it on a door doesn't mean the person it's meant for will ever see it or understand what it means and the consequences. Legal systems usually require genuine efforts to ensure proper service, things like registered mail with a return receipt, personal delivery with a signature, or other ways to verify that the person got it. Skipping these steps denies people their right to know what's happening and to take action to protect themselves.
And then the final notice came on March 6, 2021. And the demolition, well, that happened the very next day, March 7th. 24 hours notice before their homes were destroyed. It's not due process. It's barely a heads up. It doesn't give anyone a real chance to understand what's going on, prepare a response, or most importantly, use their right to appeal.
That incredibly short time frame is really worrying. The right to appeal is a key part of natural justice. The idea that legal proceedings have to be fair. It lets people challenge decisions made by lower authorities, and it helps to make sure that power isn't used without any checks and balances. Giving them just 24 hours basically eliminates that, right? It suggests that they were going to demolish those homes no matter what.
The whole purpose of the UP Urban Planning and Development Act and laws like it is to prevent exactly this kind of arbitrary action. There's supposed to be a process, checks and balances built in. But here it seems like the authorities just went straight to the most destructive option and completely ignored the legal process.
And the Supreme Court, by stepping in, is reminding everyone that these laws are there for a reason. They're not just bureaucratic hurdles that you can ignore whenever you want. They represent a commitment to fairness, transparency, and protecting individual liberties, even when dealing with tough issues like urban development and law enforcement.
You know, it's important to remember that during a previous hearing, the court actually asked the families if they wanted to rebuild their homes while the case was still going on, and their answer was so simple and so sad. They said they couldn't afford it. Just think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Not only did they lose their homes unfairly, but now they're left with nothing, unable to even start putting their lives back together.
That response speaks volumes about how vulnerable these families are and the devastating impact that these actions can have on people who don't have a lot of resources. The financial burden of rebuilding after something like this is huge, and it highlights the real human cost of ignoring the rules and acting without thinking about the consequences. It shows how the damage goes way beyond just destroying physical structures.
So now the Supreme Court has ordered compensation 10 lakh rupees to each family. It's a concrete way to try to make things right, and hopefully it'll help them financially. But as you said earlier, how do you measure the emotional toll, the loss of security and belonging? The trauma of having your home taken away so suddenly and unjustly?
The compensation acknowledges the material loss, but it doesn't address the violation of their rights or the psychological impact. It also raises a question, is this financial penalty enough to prevent abuses of power in the future? Will it be seen as a costly mistake or just the price of doing business this way? Only time will tell how this will affect things in the long run.
So to sum it all up, what we've explored today is that these demolitions in Allahabad show a worrying trend where authorities seem to be using extreme measures without following the proper legal procedures. The Supreme Court's strong reaction and their order for compensation emphasize the fundamental right to shelter and the importance of upholding legal processes no matter who's involved.
Yeah.
And as we saw with the Ambedkarnagar case, this might not be an isolated incident, but a larger pattern.
The difference between the chief minister defending bulldozer justice and the Supreme Court condemning it shows a fundamental disagreement about the role of law in government. The administration might see these actions as a way to maintain order, but the Supreme Court is reminding us that you can't do that at the expense of basic rights and legal protections that are meant for everyone.
And let's not forget the specific ways they failed to follow procedure in Allahabad, pasting notices on doors instead of properly serving them, giving only 24 hours notice before demolition, which completely goes against the UP Urban Planning and Development Act's requirements for notification and the right to appeal. These weren't just minor technicalities, they were serious violations of the law that's supposed to protect people.
These procedural safeguards aren't just red tape, they're there to prevent exactly this kind of unjust action by ignoring them. The authorities didn't just break the law, they showed a lack of respect for fairness and due process, which are essential for a just and equal society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us with a big question to think about beyond the legal arguments and the financial compensation. What happens to society when the lines get blurred between law enforcement and this kind of punitive, almost vigilante action? What happens to the trust between citizens and their government when homes can be destroyed like this without following the rules? Is sticking to the rule of law, to these established procedures, isn't that the foundation of a just and equitable society? It's something we all need to consider.